Good morning and welcome to our webinar on the KSA PDPL and all things consent. We are going to look at when to use consent and when to avoid it. My name is Laura and I'm one of the directors at GCC Data Protection. And together with my colleague Bilal, who's also director at GCC, we are going to talk you through this webinar. When we delivered the webinar this week, we went through 30 minutes of talks and scenarios and left 15 minutes for questions. Of course, this recording shouldn't take quite as long. At first, let's have a look at the brief history of the PDPL and consent. When in the very initial draft of the PDPL, only consent was available as an option for collecting and processing personal data, which at first might have seemed like a strong privacy protective stance, making sure that individuals had maximum control over their data. But in practice, they very quickly realized that only consent as a lawful basis wasn't sustainable. And therefore now under the official PDPL, as it was enforced in September last year, there are other options available. And sometimes you might find that there are better options than consent. Let's look at the definition of consent. In order for consent to be valid under the PDPL, and in fact most data protection legislation, it must be freely given, specific and informed. And also, if you are using consent, you must give people the option to withdraw their consent. Let's look at freely given. Let's imagine Bilal works in payroll and I work in customer services. Bilal meets me.
Hi Laura, I'm from payroll. Welcome to the company. We're going to pay you your first salary at the end of the month. We're going to have to send some of your information to Zatka, the tax authority. Is that okay? Can I get your agreement and consent to send it to them?
Actually, Bilal, I don't want to share my information with Zatka, so please don't.
Oh, everyone else just agrees to this and we kind of have to send it to them. Could you reconsider?
Not really, but I mean, if there isn't another option, why are you asking me?
Oh, we just thought we were being polite.
So in this scenario, Bilal should have not asked me for consent because it was quite clear that he needs this information in order to comply with another law. And therefore, legal obligation would have been better than asking for consent.
So in this scenario, we go onto a website and we're just about to use it and this box flashes up and it says, please tick here to, and then it gives a long list, accept our terms and conditions and consent to marketing emails and consent to us using your data and consent to share your information with our third parties. Now, in this scenario, we've got this box which covers all of these things. Unfortunately, this isn't specific enough. All of the consents are bundled into one, so we're consenting to lots and lots of different things all under one box. We can't decide that we're only going to consent to some things and not others. And in addition, it says using your data. That isn't specific enough. That isn't clear enough. What does that mean? So this consent, asking for consent in this way, would not be valid.
In this next scenario, we look at informed. I work in a coffee shop and Bilal is buying an espresso.
Thanks for the espresso. Can I have the bill, please?
Yes, of course you can. Here you go. And please, could I have your email address?
I'm just buying an espresso. What do you need that for?
Oh, I don't know. I've never been asked that question. We've just been trained to always ask for an email address when we present the bill to our customers. I'm not sure why.
Oh, but what are you going to do with it?
I don't actually know. I'll have to go and ask a manager. In this scenario, the coffee shop should help me understand why the data is needed. So I know that I'm meant to ask people for their email address, but I've actually never been told why and what we do with it. I should be able to explain to Bilal why I need his email address and what we are going to be doing with it. If I can't, then consent is not informed.
In this scenario, Laura's been receiving newsletters from a company. She wants to change her mind and phones the company up. She speaks to Bilal.
Hi there, Bilal. I am calling to ask you to stop sending me newsletters and communication. I've been receiving too many, and I would like you to stop sending them.
Oh, I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm just checking here. It seems like you do click on our newsletters quite a lot, and yes, you've bought things from us through them. You've already agreed to this.
I have, but I'm changing my mind. So I'd really like you to stop sending them. I'm just being inundated with lots of emails and communication from you guys, and I'm not interested in your products anymore.
Well, I'm really sorry to hear that. I'm not sure. I mean, you've already agreed to this, so I'm not really sure that we can stop.
Well, I'd like to change my mind.
So in this scenario, Laura has been receiving these emails and she very reasonably just wants to withdraw her consent. So staff need to be trained on how to manage that. If you can't withdraw the consent itself is not lawful. So in this case, the onus is on the company to train the customer service representative to make sure they know how to do this. So we've been talking about the definition of consent, and there are lots and lots of places where consent is required. The first one is what we call unnecessary processing. We can also call this nice to have processing. So let's imagine that I'm selling someone a product online. Now, obviously, there's some information I have to have. I need their payment details. I'll need their name, an address, maybe a phone number to get in touch with them if there's a problem, email. So all of those things are part of me selling to them. If I want to then use that data for something completely different, like doing some research, profiling, etc., that's unnecessary. That's not necessary for me to have that in the same way I would need a postal address. So if you are doing unnecessary processing, you will likely need consent. If you are transferring data overseas, now remember all the apps that you use, all of the online services that you use, etc., very, very likely that there is a huge global international transfer of data. If you are transferring data to a high risk overseas territory, and if the data itself is reasonably high risk, so let's imagine you're a medical service and you are sending notes to, say, Bangladesh or Pakistan for somebody to type them up, it's high risk data and those are high risk territories. I would very seriously consider consent. Any kind of marketing where it's direct marketing. Now, if I put a poster up, anyone can see it. It's not directed at specific named identified individuals. If I'm doing any other kind of marketing, whether it's postal, phoning people up, emails, or social media marketing where I'm identifying individuals, I will need consent to send that marketing information out to them. Again, surveys is a little bit like unnecessary processing, but a lot of people do surveys. And so it's really important to remember a survey, you might think that it's of benefit to your company to improve your service, but actually, if you are going to send a survey out to people, it is likely you're going to need consent. If you collected information and are processing it for one purpose and then decide you're going to need to do something else completely different with it, then you are likely to need consent. Credit data disclosure. Now remember, your credit data, your bank balance, your credit worthiness, they're not just held by your card provider or your bank. It sits in a big ecosystem, credit clearing houses, finance houses, insurance, etc. If any one company approaches a credit organization and asks them to disclose data, consent will be needed to share that data on. If you are processing sensitive data, if there's absolutely no other lawful basis under which this will fall, it is very, very likely that you will need consent. And by sensitive data, we mean all that stuff like health data, nationality, religion, etc. And finally, automated processing. So whenever your data is being processed automatically, which often means an AI, or it could mean an algorithm of some kind of program, if it is being processed in that way and there's no human interaction in that processing, then you will need consent. A very good example is you go onto LinkedIn, you apply for a job. Usually your application is not seen by a human being. It's usually screened out initially by an AI, which will look at match keywords together and decide that you are or aren't a good fit. So when you receive your rejection, it's probably not come from a human being initially. That would be an example of automated processing.
And now we're going to look at what other options, which are also called lawful bases, are available in order to collect and process personal data, and why consent may not be the best option. First of all, whatever you're trying to do may be required by law. You might have a legal obligation, such as you have a law in Saudi Arabia, whereby some organizations must have CCTV on their premises. In that case, it is required by law, and that would be your basis for processing data. So where a law tells you that the processing is required, you would use legal obligation rather than consent. Legitimate interest is an option that you would use where the processing is in the interest of the controller, and it doesn't override the rights and freedoms of the individual. So, for example, you could use it for fraud prevention in online transactions. And the rationale there is that the company has a legitimate interest in protecting itself and its customers from fraud. And as long as there's no sensitive data being processed, you would then use legitimate interest as it's more appropriate. Agreement or contract, this is the lawful basis that you would use where you are about to or have an agreement with the individual. This can be as easy as I walk into a shop, I'm buying a product, the cashier needs to process my payment in order for me to buy the product. We have an agreement in place there. So agreement or contract is what you could use. Similarly, if you have an employment contract, or you start a gym membership. These are all agreements or contracts, and that's where the processing is necessary in order for this agreement or the contract to take place. We have actual interest, and that is actual interest of the data subjects, and usually that would apply where you're trying to prevent harm or to enhance the moral or material situation of the individual. So, for example, a hospital receives an unconscious patient in an emergency room. The doctors urgently need to access the patient's medical history, and that's to provide immediate life-saving treatment. So in that case, you can't talk to the data subject, but it's in their actual interest, in their vital interest even, to process the data, and in that case, it is lawful to do so. And then lastly, we have public interest, and that generally applies to ministries and governments where it is in the public interest to process data. So, for example, the Saudi immigration authorities use biometric screening at airports to verify the identity of travelers, and that's to prevent illegal entry and to enhance border security. And the rationale for using public interest here is that the controller is, first of all, a public entity, and processing is necessary for national security and border control purposes.
So there are lots of steps that we've been kind of talking through about managing consent. Let's bring them all together. So obviously the first thing to do is to make sure it's the most appropriate option. Sometimes it's a bit silly to ask for consent when, for example, you have a legal obligation, to make sure that it's the right thing to do in the first place. Remember, the consent has to be freely given, informed, and specific. So you've got to give people information about it. You've got to train your staff to manage the withdrawal of consent. You should always be prepared for people to change their minds, and they're absolutely allowed to. You must record what people are consenting to. A lot of organizations will have 100 forms, and the statements will change constantly as to exactly what people are consenting to. You know, I might be running a campaign on one thing, and then I'm running a campaign on something completely different. Your system has to record not just that they gave consent, but specifically what they consented to, at what time and what date. And there are systems out there that will do that for you. You should decide how long consent lasts for. Now, this is a bit tricky because the PDPL is silent on this. Generally, it's thought that if I consent to something, so I'm 52 years old, if I consent to something today, does my consent last until I hit 80 years old? It doesn't seem like it probably ethically does. Also, my consent is probably not very useful several years later. So I might consent to receiving, for example, emails about rental properties, but actually it's probably only useful for me to have that consent for a short amount of time. And then it becomes commercially pointless to keep emailing me when I never respond. So exactly for that reason, you have to have a mechanism to review consents that are kind of out of date, not just from the ethical point of view, but from the commercial point of view. There's no point hanging on to a consent for too long because the chances of someone continuing with your service 10 years later is very, very low. And you might then want to go out and ask people to renew their consent. The chances are that people who are actually interested in your service will renew their consent, and then you know that they are high value customers. You have to have mental capacity in order to consent, and children, which are defined as under 18s, can't consent themselves. So if you are directly collecting information about children or from children, you will need parental consent. And in the case of people with lacking mental capacity, you will need consent from a guardian. And finally, just to remember, if you are going to process the data for further purposes, consent is probably a good way to go if there is no other lawful basis.
All right, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions for us, please do send us an email. We're always happy to chat and or have a conversation with you. And we will see you at our next webinar.
Thank you.